So thank you for coming out in such large numbers so early on your weekend. My thanks also to the museum, to the various organizers and hosts and sponsors for making this event possible. By training, I'm a linguist, but I'm a linguist with an interest in prehistory. So I like to try and use language in order to reconstruct aspects of prehistory, which can then be compared with the results that come from other disciplines, so disciplines such as archaeology and genetics, and the case of the links to linguistics, especially population genetics. What I'd like to do this morning is to look at one of the methods that is used in comparative linguistics in order to try and find out about prehistory. In particular, to try and establish that languages that are spoken today or that we know from the historical record are related to one another in the sense of having a common ancestor. And that, of course, takes us to prehistory because that common ancestor was spoken before the historical record. It's something we're reconstructing about prehistory. So you may well have heard about various language families. Here you have a picture of the geographic distribution of the Indo-European language family. The chronology is sort of mixed. For modern languages, it's basically their modern distribution. For ancient languages, it's the ancient distribution. But Indo-European is a well-established language family. You've probably heard that it exists. You may have heard about Proto-Indo-European, its reconstructed ancestor. But maybe you haven't heard so much about how linguists go about reconstructing that common ancestor language. Likewise, you may have heard of the Austronesian language family, spoken across much of insular Southeast Asia, South Pacific, and even going as far west as Madagascar, a point to which I will return later. Again, what kinds of methods might one use in order to show that these languages are related to one another, and, if possible, in order to reconstruct features of their common ancestor? Now, obviously, we're looking for similarities. So if we want to claim that two languages are related, we must find some similarities. But crucially, not just any similarity will do. Clearly, if some feature is universal to language, then there's not much point using it in trying to establish language families. So if I say, well, English and Japanese both have consonants, well, that doesn't tell me very much about whether they're related or not, because all spoken languages have consonants. If I say the two languages have the sound p, then again, not quite all languages have that sound. Many varieties of Arabic, for instance, lack a p sound, a p sound. But most languages of the world have that. So that, again, is not going to be very diagnostic. I also have to be careful that if I'm looking at enough languages and enough words, eventually I'm going to find some similarities that are purely due to chance. About 30 years ago, I happened to be working on two languages. One, Japanese. This was a private language project. Since then, we have two grown-up children. Plus a scientific research project, Haruai, so doing field work on a language spoken in the highlands of New Guinea. And one of the words I learned in Japanese, so favorite Japanese food, unagi, an eel, and in Haruai the word happens to be unang. Now I didn't immediately sit down and write a paper on Proto-Japanese Haruai, because if you look at the rest of the vocabulary, you don't see any similarities. Probably this is pure chance. Almost certainly this is pure chance. You also, of course, need to be careful, and this is actually the hardest part, similarities that might be the result of borrowing, of contact. So two languages come into contact, they borrow features from one another, they will therefore develop similarities that are not the result of common ancestry. This is a trivial example, so the Japanese word kimono and the English word kimono. We're not going to use those to try and establish that Japanese and English have a single common ancestor. So what we're looking for are similarities due to common ancestry. And I've given a couple of examples here, a couple of Latin words and English words, which are in fact related in this way. So Latin pater, meaning father, Latin piscis, meaning fish. They may be not as obviously similar as some of the words we looked at before, but nonetheless it is possible to show that there are systematic similarities across these two languages and across the various Indo-European languages. Now, what we need to look for in order to establish a common ancestor are regular correspondences. Regular correspondences, for instance, in the sound systems, in the phonetics, in the phonology of the two languages. So one systematic way in which Latin and English are related is that across a wide range of words, Latin has a P sound, where English, along with the other Germanic languages, has an F sound. So pater, father, piscis, fish, they fit into a larger pattern. And the reason why we end up with those systematic correspondences is because of a general property, general, not 100% exceptionless, but a general property of language change, in particular sound change. And that is a generalization that was established in the late 19th century. In a given environment, given phonetic environment, a given sound always changes in the same way. So from comparing Latin P, English F, P in most of the Indo-European languages, we can reconstruct that Proto-Indo-European almost certainly had a P in those words, and that in the Germanic languages, so by the time you shift from Proto-Indo-European to an intermediate stage, Proto-Germanic, that had shifted to an F. What I'm going to do now is to illustrate this with a particular example. I had initially thought that, maybe I would do a kind of audience participation. We would actually work together through this example, but the audience is a little too numerous to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the data. I will sort of invite you to think about it, but I will then sort of present the answer. So we're going to look at some verb forms in a couple of ancient Indo-European languages and compare them and try and see what the systematic correspondences are and what the probable situation was in their ancestral language. The two languages we're going to be looking at are Ancient Greek and Sanskrit. So Ancient Greek, the language of Greece, in version here around the 5th century BCE. Sanskrit, or more accurately Vedic, so the language of the Vedas, the sacred writings of Hinduism. And we're going to use these data in order to try and reconstruct the corresponding forms in Proto-Indo-European. So PIE is Proto-Indo-European. The particular forms I've selected may look similar. You may just look at them and say, oh, of course, those are similar. But the similarity was not obvious. In fact, we know it was not obvious to speakers of the two languages, because when Alexander the Great, a native speaker of ancient Greek, went the furthest extent of his journey of conquest to India, he wanted to have discussions on philosophy with the local Indian intellectuals. And in order to have these discussions, he had to go through a series of interpreters. Okay, so the languages, some forms may look obviously similar, but the languages overall are not so obviously similar. Okay, so we have the forms in these two languages. Now we want to try and reconstruct their common ancestor. Well, one thing we can do to start off with is where the two languages have identical forms, so those are the points, the letters highlighted in red here, where they're identical, then we can very plausibly reconstruct that back to the ancestral language. So in Proto-Indo-European, already at this point, we can reconstruct all of the R's, we can reconstruct at least some of the T's, and at least one of the N's. Should point out that the problem set that we're looking at, although it's real, these are real data, these are the actual forms, in a sense it's a toy problem, so I've picked a particularly clear example, a relatively simple example, one that doesn't involve too many complications. It does involve a couple of complications. So of the verb forms, the singular one, I carried, singular two, you carried, singular three, he, she, or it carried, those are found in both languages. In the dual, we too carried, that's found in Sanskrit but not in ancient Greek. So we can't do any reconstruction. We don't have any basis on which to carry out a reconstruction. Maybe ancient Greek lost that form, but at any rate, nothing to reconstruct. However, you too carried, they too carried, there we can do a reconstruction. We all carried, it happens that the two forms turn out ultimately not to be related, despite their great similarity. So that again we'll not be able to do anything with. You all carried, they all carried, those we will be able to reconstruct. So far we've been able to reconstruct what is identical across the two languages. Now it gets a little bit more difficult because now we want to try and reconstruct where there are differences in the two languages. So let's look at the nasals, the N and the M sounds at the end of words. In fact, if you look at the highlighted examples here, you'll notice that ancient Greek consistently has N in word final position, whereas Sanskrit sometimes has M and sometimes, as in the third person plural, has N. So the question arises, what should we reconstruct to the ancestral language? Was it more like Greek, and did the ancient Indians decide that they didn't want all those N's at the end of their ends of their words? For variety, they decided to change some of them to an M. Or was the ancestral language more like Sanskrit, and Greek lost that opposition? Greek merged word final M's and N's to an N. Now, if you think about the principle of regularity of sound change, then it becomes clear that only the second of those is a possible solution. If we start off with N at the end of all the words, there's no way we can have a regular sound change that will sometimes give us N and sometimes give us M in Sanskrit. Compare the singular one form at the top with the plural three form at the bottom. They're identical in ancient Greek, they're distinct in Sanskrit. So, other things being equal, Sanskrit is probably the more archaic stage with respect to this particular phenomenon. So, we can establish in those positions, sometimes Proto-Indo-European had an N, which remained unchanged. Sometimes it had an M, which remained unchanged in Sanskrit, but shifted to N in ancient Greek. So we can reconstruct those parts of Proto-Indo-European as indicated here. So Proto-Indo-European, in this respect, is like Sanskrit in sometimes having final M, sometimes having final N. They contrast with one another. The first person singular verb form and the third person plural verb form, I carried, they all carried, are distinct from one another in Sanskrit as in Proto-Indo-European. Ancient Greek, however, has merged the M and the N, has lost that opposition in word final position. And in fact, if you look at ancient Greek, it is impossible in ancient Greek to have the consonant M at the end of a word. It just doesn't occur in no word, in no form of a word. If you enjoy doing Sudoku, incidentally, you will love doing this. Okay, so we've dealt with the nasals at the end of words. What about the vowels? Now, these Sanskrit forms look a little bit boring. I mean, Sanskrit does have other vowels in other words, but in these words, the vowels are all a, all the way through. So abaram, abara, abarat. I carried, you carried, he, she, or it carried. So Sanskrit has lots and lots of a vowels. By contrast, Greek has more variety. So sometimes in Greek we find the vowel e, and sometimes in Greek we find the vowel o. So a form like eperon, first person singular, I carried, with two different vowels, whereas Sanskrit has that a vowel all the way through. So again, what are we going to reconstruct? How can we set this up to show that the two languages are related, to show that they're related systematically, that they're related by the operation of regular sound changes applying to what we reconstruct as the ancestor language? Well, here it turns out that ancient Greek must show the more archaic form. So ancient Greek distinguishes the vowels e and o. In fact, it also has a vowel a, basically a 5-vowel system. So ancient Greek makes these distinctions among the vowels, whereas Sanskrit has lost this distinction. So we can think of two rules which did not, two changes. They did not operate in Greek. In Greek, basically nothing happened with these particular vowels, whereas in the process leading from Proto-Indo-European to Sanskrit, the vowel e shifted to a, and likewise the vowel o shifted to a. And the vowel a, we didn't have any examples of that, but the vowel a, Proto-Indo-European, remained as a in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit actually merges 3 vowels into one. So we can reconstruct, again, we can now reconstruct the vowels. So the vowels here are identical. I haven't dealt with the long vowels, the dual third person, but in the other forms where we have short vowels, then basically it's the ancient Greek system which we reconstruct. I think it's an important insight, one which came late 18th, early 19th century, that the reconstructed language is not necessarily closer to, certainly not identical to any one of the descendant languages. In a sense, what you will do as you carry out the reconstruction is, in some respects, one language will be more archaic. In other respects, another language will be more archaic. So the ancestor language will end up being distinct from all of the other languages, all of the attested languages. I say it was an important insight because before that insight, people were actually looking around among existing languages to try and find ancestor languages. So they were asking, what is the ancestor language of the Indo-European family? And early on, they came up with the answer Sanskrit. We can see that's wrong. Sanskrit has actually innovated in many respects. So we're reconstructing a language spoken in prehistory, a language for which we have no documents, but a reconstruction which follows very systematic method and therefore enables us to make good predictions, good hypotheses about what the ancestor language must have looked like. Here I have given the final answer. So this reconstructs everything. If you want, I haven't done everything, so if you want if you want a homework assignment, then you could sort of look at the third-person singular form where Sanskrit has a final T, ancient Greek doesn't. Of course, you're given the answer. The question would be, why is that the right answer? That was Indo-European. Let's now look briefly at Austronesian. One point which I mentioned in talking about Austronesian was that its main focus is insular Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, insular Southeast, actually insular Southeast and East Asia, going up to Taiwan, which we now believe, on both linguistic and archaeological and genetic grounds, was probably the staging point for the expansion of Austronesian languages. But there's one place where Austronesian languages, an Austronesian language or group of languages is spoken that is rather surprising, and that is the island of Madagascar off the east coast of Africa. If, as a linguist, I had known nothing about the language of Madagascar, and I had looked at a map and seen where it's located, knowing that the languages on the coast, the opposite coast of the mainland of Africa, are Bantu languages, then my immediate guess would be, oh, well, probably the language spoken on Madagascar will be Bantu. But it isn't. It's Austronesian. And the fact that it is Austronesian is something that was worked out by linguists all on their own. I'm sort of very proud of this example because linguists worked this one out long before archaeologists, geneticists, anyone else got into the game. In fact, even early travelers sort of exploring the Indian Ocean area, if they landed in Madagascar, talked to the local people, then went on to the East Indies, talked to the local people, already they noted similarities. And in the mid-20th century, a very systematic comparison was done by a Norwegian linguist, Otto Christian Dahl, comparing Malagasy with Malanyan, which is a language of Borneo in what is now Indonesia. So these two languages have a number of similarities. So you see some basic words here, basic vocabulary items, which are indeed similar. But just as with Indo-European, I'm not going to go through the problem set here, but you find systematic correspondences. So Malanyan has a contrast between two vowels, u and o. In Malagasy, they have merged into a single vowel, which somewhat confusingly, and I apologize for this, is written with the letter O, but pronounced U. Okay, so Malanyan Wulo has two separate vowels. It comes out in Malagasy as Vulu. So in this respect, the common ancestor language must have looked more like Malanyan, had more vowels than Malagasy has. So Malagasy is clearly an Austronesian language. However, speakers of Malagasy have interacted with speakers of Bantu languages from the mainland, interacted linguistically, so that, for instance, the Malagasy word for dog, or one of the words for dog, ambwa, is a loan from Bantu. Compare the Swahili word mbwa. It's hard to tell exactly which Bantu language the word was borrowed from because the relevant Bantu languages are all very similar, but at any rate, the Bantu origin is very clear. We can, of course, now compare that data with data from other disciplines. What I've done here is to take a comparison from one study. There are many studies on Malagasy genetics. This is one study. What it shows is the Y chromosomal haplogroups of Malagasy. So in terms of a pie diagram, so the pie diagram shows the percentage of Y chromosomes, or percentage of male subjects belonging to each of the haplogroups. And for comparison, you have the pie chart for East Africa and the pie chart for various places, other places where Austronesian languages are spoken. And Banjarmasin here in Borneo is actually the place closest to where Malanyan is spoken. You'll notice if you look at the East African pie chart and the Banjarmasin pie chart, there's very little similarity between them. The Malagasy pie chart is roughly halfway between. It's sort of it's a mixture of various haplogroups or various lineages from East Africa and various lineages from the East Indies. So the language is basically Austronesian, but has borrowed some words from the Bantu, neighboring Bantu languages. Genetically, the population, as seen here in the male line, is mixed, partly coming from East Indian lineages, partly coming from East African lineages. Now, I mentioned that the Indo-European example that I showed you was a toy example, so it's one which works out reasonably well. That method, the comparative method, if it were perfect, then you might expect, well, maybe we can go on reconstructing forever. Reconstruct this, reconstruct two proto-languages, compare them, reconstruct their ancestor, and compare everything, get back to a single common ancestor. There are, alas, some strong limitations of the method. One is that with time, shared material gets lost. As it happens, from the Indo-European languages that are attested, we know that there was a Proto-Indo-European word, something like ekwos, meaning a horse. We find it in Latin, we find it in Sanskrit, we find it in Old Irish, we even find it in Old English, but it has not survived to the modern language. So material gets lost. That makes the comparison more difficult because you have fewer items to work with. Sometimes sound change does not behave regularly. In general it does, but there are exceptions, sometimes, for instance, with very frequent words, perhaps because they're used so frequently, often unstressed, unaccented, unusual changes take place. So the Old English word seo, which we generally accept to be the ancestor of modern English she, should really have given modern English see. So if the sound changes had operated regularly, instead of saying she sells seashells by the seashore, we would have been saying she sells seashells by the seashore. I knew I shouldn't put that example in. Compare German Sie, which it starts with a Z rather than an S, but it's the regular reflex, whereas English has undergone an exceptional change there. So there are limitations on the method. There's also, I would add, a practical limitation that, of course, it's a very slow method if you're doing it by hand. Fortunately, we now have large databases. We now have the possibility of using tools from phylogenetics, which means that we can now take masses of data and work through that data much more quickly. But typically, the final test still requires us to follow the slow, traditional comparative method to verify that everything is right. And I'll illustrate this will be my last point, with one instance of two groups of languages which have been hypothesized by earlier linguists to be perhaps related, but where we now have reasonably solid evidence on the basis of regular sound correspondences. The two families are Na-Dene, so the Athabascan languages, plus Eyak and Tlingit, spoken in the western part of North America, mainly the northwestern part, and the Yeniseian languages spoken along the river Yenisei in Siberia. There are 3 dots here, there's actually only one surviving Yeniseian language, Ket, but some of the others are known from historical records. We can find regular correspondences. So for instance, where Ket, a Yeniseian language, has a long vowel with a high level tone, so say the word for snow or ice is teak, the word for liver, sing, the word for willow, tul. Where you find that vowel quality and that tone in Ket, in the Na-Dene languages, so illustrated here by Proto-Na-Dene and by Proto-Athabascan, you find a glottalized consonant. So a consonant something like ah, contrasting with ta. So the word for ice in Proto-Na-Dene, fortunately there are no speakers of Proto-Na-Dene around, so I can't be contradicted on this, but it would sound something like ik. The word for liver, something like sunt. And the word for plant, something like twit. By contrast, where Ket has a vowel with a glottal constriction, kind of vowel, that generally corresponds to a simple consonant in Na-Dene. So, say the Ket word, I'll take the word for finger, so tuk, tuk. And in Proto-Athabascan Eyak, the form is tuk, with a k, an ordinary k sound, no glottalization. So we have regular correspondences between the Yeniseian languages and the Na-Dene languages. Since the languages have not been in recent contact, this is probably not due to borrowing. These words almost certainly have not been borrowed. They must go back a long way in history, so in prehistory, so the languages are probably related to one another. So just to summarize, what I've tried to do is to take you through the lab of a working linguist, a working historical linguist, so that you get to see not only the results, and sometimes the results, different linguists will present you with different, mutually incompatible results. So you can't just look at the results and say, oh, okay, good, I just look at the results and work with that. I've also tried to take you through some of the methodology to show you ways in which the methodology can work successfully, some of the problems that arise and which therefore give rise to differences of opinion among linguists. I've also tried to at least to mention the fact that more recent methods, many from phylogenetics, do enable us to work much more quickly through far greater sets of data, but nonetheless the ultimate check of whether a particular reconstruction, a particular claim about common ancestry is viable or not, needs to make use of the traditional comparative method. Thank you.